This is the Unregistered podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. This is a show about ideas, people, and behaviors that are considered inappropriate, out of bounds, or beyond the pale. The things you're not supposed to talk about if you're a school teacher, a college professor, a businessman, a politician, a parent, a neighbor, or even a podcast host. These are the things you're not supposed to say or even think if you're a good liberal, a good conservative, or a good citizen. Each week, I'll interview a person who has something bad to say. They might be a journalist or a professor. They might be a porn star or a drug dealer. They might just be an ordinary person with an ordinary job who doesn't care about the rules of polite society. I'm not interested in breaking the rules just to be a troublemaker. I'm interested in people who break the rules of conventional thought and to expand the scope of what is possible to say in our society. I'm interested in people who make me think. Next month, I'll be giving 2 talks in the Midwest. On November 19th, I'll be giving a talk in Des Moines, Iowa. And the following day, November 20th, I'll be in Chicago giving a talk at the famous Beat Kitchen Club. For more information and to get your tickets, go to thaddeusrussell.com/talks. My uncle, David Russell, was born and raised in the Midwest in the 1930s and 1940s. His father, my grandfather, was a Mormon minister. His family, my family, was as puritanical as you can imagine. All forms of sex and sexuality outside of marriage, of course, were considered to be sinful. But even many forms of sexuality inside of a marriage were considered to be wicked as well. I remember being amazed that my grandparents slept in separate twin beds. My Uncle Dave, like a good Mormon, got married at a very early age, had 3 children, worked as a librarian in places like Cheyenne, Wyoming, and Medford, Oregon. When Dave lived in Medford, several times a year he would visit my father and me in Berkeley. And during the day, he would go off to San Francisco and spend the whole day there by himself, and sometimes late into the night. This was in the early 1980s. One day, Dave called my dad on the phone and told him that he had just had a family meeting, in which he had told his wife and his 3 children 2 things. 1, he said, I'm gay. 2, I want a divorce. At which point, one of Dave's sons, my cousin, stood up and said, I'm gay too. Dave later told my father that he had never once had any sexual attraction to a woman at all. And yet he remained married to a woman for decades because he simply felt like he had no options. After that, Dave came to visit us much more frequently. And this time, when he would go to San Francisco, he would come back every night and have dinner with us and tell us about all the pleasures and freedoms he had been experiencing all day. Dave would go to the bars and the nightclubs and the sex shops in the Castro district. We also found out that he had been going to the bathhouses as well. I had never, at that point, seen a person so free and so happy. Dave became my hero. A couple years later, we found out that Dave had contracted HIV. Until his health declined dramatically, Dave continued to visit us and continued to enjoy the pleasures of San Francisco. Dave met and fell in love with a man who became his boyfriend. Dave died 20 years later from complications of HIV, but he spent those years as a free man. My guest this week has devoted her life's work to creating a world in which people are free of the stigma, the shame, and the ignorance that kept my Uncle Dave locked away in that closet for all those years, and that keep every one of us in our own personal closet, regardless of our gender, our sex, or our preferences. The kind of sexual freedom that Dave experienced is for all of us. This is my interview with Carol Queen. So I'm in San Francisco on Polk Street in a store that I think might be the most radical place on earth. We are in the city of work. We are in a place where people are rushing to and fro. It's Thursday morning, going to and from work, coming from their little homes, going to their houses in their cars. They're very, very busy. They're very busy doing things, usually for other people or for society in general. We're in a place that is devoted not to any of that. We're in a place that's devoted to this thing called pleasure, but it's even worse than that. We're in a place that's devoted to women's pleasure, maybe primarily, but it's even worse than that. It's devoted to women's individual pleasure.
The care of the self.
The care of the self. And I'm with a witch who's in charge of the damn thing, who's responsible for much of this, who has been for many, many years, decades now, been subverting civilization from within through this very means by introducing, in particular women, but everyone, ways to pleasure themselves and not necessarily the rest of society. Is that fair to say, Carol Queen?
That's fair to say. I would say that when one gets into pleasuring oneself, sometimes one wants to share the technologies and tips that they have learned with partners. So there is no way that we are anti-partner sex around here. We just want people to, if they need to be accessorized.
Absolutely.
And at the bare minimum, be informed and, get a little curious about what is possible, because that's what they don't teach you in sex ed. Well, they don't teach you anything in sex ed much, but except don't do that. But how to be curious, how to know enough to take the steps away from what you thought was quote unquote normal and into what might be awesome and perfect for you. Who learns that until they get old enough to go and start to explore? And
right.
Good Vibrations has been that outpost for 40 years.
40 years.
And I didn't start this rolling, but I have now been with this entity, this company, but it's a little more than that. Spaceship Good Vibrations, longer than any other living human. And it's such an honor. I thought I was just coming to, work Saturdays to help them out for a little while. And then boom, I got involved.
So I meant all of that in my introduction. I mean, I think most people, when they hear it's a vibrator store, will either laugh it off or be dismissive or maybe be, scandalized by it. But I do think this is maybe the center of the revolution in some ways, because as you well know, civilization in all its forms has often or maybe always been built on the repression, not just of sexuality, but of women's sexuality in particular. This is a very old lesson people like you and I had learned when we started reading books by people like Sigmund Freud, et cetera, right?
Right.
And I think this has just been corroborated for me by reading scads of American historical literature that show that very much so this was always the intention, was to repress sexuality in the service of building American civilization or Western civilization or the rest of it.
Also, lately, the news.
Well,
also the news.
We can get into that later. Sure. There are certainly always remnants of history around. Absolutely. But I mean, to me, it is foundational, and I'm certainly not the first person to say this.
Oh, no.
And so to me, walking by this store, everyone should actually pause. And there's these stores as a chain, so they're all over the country. Every time someone walks by Good Vibrations, I would like for them to think differently about it. It is funny in some ways, and it is playful, and it is even sort of childlike, sure. But it is the most, I think, radical thing possibly one could do in this culture, given its history.
And this is the place that changed the perspective on these fabulous implements, these sex toys, as we call them, which does sound a little childlike, but on the other hand, tools sounds like it's too much work to even get going. So, and we want to infuse the whole idea with play and creativity, because that's where some of the best sex comes from, and the greatest degree of confidence about all of that comes from. And when Joni Blank, our founder, started this place up, what she wanted to do was get good quality stuff as much as she could pull together in those days. The original store was about the size of a postage stamp, but had some things that other people didn't have yet, or you couldn't get anywhere else really. And she wanted to inform customers about how to use them, sort of the matrix of information that makes good sex good was not really taken care of by anybody else in a systematic way. Still kind of isn't. But the sex positive movement, sex positive feminist community, the the women and everybody else sex toy store movement that we arguably were a founding entity of, certainly on this coast, we know that those are the things that matter when someone walks in a place like this. They walk around and they look around and they say, why are there so many of those things?
Right.
Because not everybody is the same. That's why. Well, who knew?
Yeah. So let's talk about history. We're actually sitting not in the store part of the store, but we're sitting in back, which is where there is this incredible museum called the Antique Vibrator Museum, which is what it sounds like. So you go around counterclockwise, I think, in this room, and you go from about the 60s, 70s is the first one you have?
Probably the 1870s. It's a little hard to know because that first hand crank one up at the top they made from the 1850s until 1910, 1915. Yeah. And we're not exactly sure what year that one popped off the assembly line, but it has its roots in the 19th century.
Mid-19th century, yeah.
And vibrators that are other than hand crank start in the 1860s. The first one we know of is we have a wall talking text because we're a museum, and we have a picture of that one, but we have never found one to actually acquire. I don't know if there are any left, but it was a massage table sized, steam powered gizmo.
Steam powered.
Like a locomotive. A steam powered gizmo with a big orb sticking out of it so that the patient, because it was in those days a patient, this wasn't a home playroom setup, or was it? Who knows? There's some of the history we probably don't know, but they could hike up their bustle and cuddle right down on that thing and get treated for hysteria. So virtually everything in the museum that you see is what happened when these got but shared by doctors and started being marketed to individuals and to families and so forth. And it was to treat hysteria and many other ailments because, like patent medicine in those days, if you had something that might work, you might as well say that it did.
Right.
Actually, that might not be too unusual even today. And so there was marketing involved. And so we have I have my back right now to the 19-teens wall, and you can see everything over there looks pretty steampunk compared to what we know of today, the sleek silicone vibrators with computer chip that you plug into a USB port. That's not what they were selling 100 years ago. Right.
Now, it was marketed as to cure neurasthenia, this nervous condition that they invented for women. But what did they actually, do we know what they actually did with it, the doctors?
Well, yeah. When the neurasthenic women, the women who had been diagnosed with hysteria, came to the doctor, just feeling just a little bad, I guess, just not feeling up to snuff, not at their peak. The doctors had found that applying the vibrator to the clitoris and vulva. And leaving it there till the point of hysterical paroxysms of relief.
Oh, my God.
Quote, unquote.
Oh, they did do this. Okay.
They did do this.
Oh.
Now, when we opened the museum here, I heard from Vice magazine in London, and they were like, tell me about the old dildos. I'm like, these are not old dildos. Everybody, you would think that Vice would have thought about sex toys enough to get this cleared up. Vice, of all people, heavens. Dildos are for insertion. Vibrators might these days be used for insertion, but none of the things that you're seeing around you were intended to be used for vaginal insertion. Sure. This just wasn't their function. And of course, that's not the most effective way to provoke a hysterical paroxysm of relief or an orgasm either. Clitoral and vulval touch or vibration. And prior to vibrators being invented, it was touch. There were doctors helpers, nurses, midwives, people like that, who were trained to do this by hand massage, which worked but took a long time. Plus then, to poor doctor's wrist hurt after that all day long. Seriously, that's a lot. That's a lot of wrist moving for one doctor to do. I feel bad for them. And just that's repetitive strain. They
needed technology, you know.
They needed a technology, and they got one.
This is just for the doctors, not for the women.
Right, exactly. Now, of course, the logical next question is, they gave women orgasms. There is this is a controversial question. To our knowledge, there is little to no indication that any of these folks knew and were clear and upfront about what we would call this behavior today. It was couched in, velvet draped in the medicalization of women's sexuality, and women weren't given sexual information. And did some of them know that it was a sexual climax? Well, probably somebody did.
Yeah, that's what
there
I'm
was a dude, there he is on our wall, Nathaniel Highmore, in that lace collar, long ago, just post-Enlightenment. He was like,
17th century.
Dudes, he didn't say dudes. Are we sure this isn't an orgasm that we're talking about here when we're doing this treatment? Because, to which I say, right on, Mrs. Highmore, if there was one.
Thank you for your service.
Right on, Nathaniel. you were paying close attention to the function of the human form. Good for you. But was everybody else? Was female sexuality a topic that was allowed?
Of course not.
So much.
Yep.
No. I mean, Freud even had a little trouble with it, right?
Indeed.
And he was brilliant in all kinds of ways. He took the steps that helped us, get over this fence that had been made, to put whatever anybody might have called female sexuality. Female sexuality was what they did with men. Female sexuality was the mother and the whore. Female sexuality was the angel in the house who didn't have any voluptuous feelings. Female sexuality was for those lower classes, those bawds, those sluts. Female sexuality was not the way we think of it today, and we have a long way to get really good at it today. So the what at the heart of this whole story is, as you started with, you've got to know some history about how repressed things have been around sex, and especially around female sexuality.
Yeah. Are there any records? Is there any evidence of women talking about it in this way and knowing that it's an orgasm they're experiencing?
If only I had
nothing.
Letters. If only I had diaries. Yeah. I'm not saying there is nothing, but I don't know where or what. Yeah. I don't know who, this is the sort of thing that when people's grandkids discovered it in the 1930s, they took it out back and threw it in the fire pit in the backyard, right? Yeah. So they threw stuff in the fireplace. There's been a lot of intimate history of all kinds.
Oh, yeah.
That has just been destroyed. And I should say here that that I don't go dig around in musty attics looking for history. If only I had the time. Who has the time? The person who had the time was Rachel Maines, who is a terrific feminist historian who in the 1970s saw some ads for vibrators in old women's magazines, needlework magazines.
It's sort of a hilarious story. Wasn't she working on a PhD project that was about needlework?
A completely different thing having to do with textiles. And she was like, "Oh, women's work. What do we do? Let's look into that. What's this? An ad for a vibrator?" And what the sort of joke I tell when I'm doing the tour here and talking about this period is I put words in her mouth and say, I thought that was a recently invented tool of the feminist sexual revolution. And of course, indeed it was, except that it wasn't.
Right. Now, what's the period we're talking about that Maines was looking at?
Maines started in the late 1970s, roughly the time that Joni was starting Good Vibrations. And so the two of them found each other relatively soon after Maines started doing her research, and her book wasn't published until 2000 or so. And so there was a good generation worth of digging around in old medical texts in Greek and stuff like that that she did. And her book, The Technology of Orgasm, is really the story that I've internalized and tell as a curator of this museum. So is there more to say about this? Is there more research to do about this? Well, I hope so. And if we found that kind of first person documentation of what women knew and, you know, what era they knew it, that would be amazing.
Absolutely.
And all you listeners, if you find your great grandmother's letters stuffed in the wall, please don't burn them. Yes. All the archives want them now, seriously.
And Carol wants you to look for the sex stuff in it, mostly.
For sure.
Yes.
Although everything about...
As do I.
everything about the way your forebears lived their lives is interesting. I'm not sure we have enough love for history in this particular moment in time, but everything is interesting.
But isn't it amazing that the most interesting thing about people is the one thing that gets ignored and passed over and dismissed?
Isn't that funny?
Isn't that funny?
Isn't that funny? Well, I will tell you that when you get deeply into sexuality, it both leads you away from the everyday condition of modern life and, you know, likes on Facebook and whatever the hell everybody's bothered with, and also right back to it and deeply into the politics of the present and thinking about what is possible for the future. It takes you on a, well, maybe it's a spiral path. I'm using that in a different sense than it's often used, but maybe that's what it is.
Yeah.
And I think that this is part of the whole gift that a place like the Antique Vibrator Museum can give us. We walk in here, we look around, we see stuff from the very early years of the 20th century. We start to see what happens when Art Deco design shows up in the 1930s and starts to make some of the vibrators look pretty cool. Wait, is that Bakelite? I've heard of that on Antiques Roadshow. And then, if you walk back out the door, there sure are a lot of vibrators out there, and they're both different and just the same as these. They're sold in a different context. They're manufactured and conceived of in a different context, really, partly because we all know that they're a sex toy now. And whoever knew that then wasn't leading with that in their ads that Rachel Maines saw. Right. My favorite. Almost like a miracle is the healing power of vibration when rightly applied. To which I say, right on.
To which I say, put down the needlepoint.
Yeah. Honestly, ma'am, you're wasting your afternoon.
I mean, you know, the good mom and the good wife will do the needlepoint. And this is kind of the point I've been trying to make here since the beginning of the interview, right? Is that you guys are a little bit subversive. And the story, the good mom and the wife were probably not the people who were stepping up to make porn in the late teens and early 20s. That, among many other things, all the things, includes little use of vibrators as quote unquote foreplay devices. And that's what let the cat out of the bag. I mean, that was what turned the doctors away. That was what took this out of the hands of medicine and of course the consumer world, the people who sold them. They didn't want to stop selling them, but they couldn't really, it wasn't time yet for them to say, look, a superior sex toy, like we started to do in the 70s. So what they did was say, health, vigor, beauty. Look at these. Every home needs one for all the reasons. And there's a book that we have here, Open to Its Hysteria chapter. The book is called Health and How to Get It, which is a great title. But every other chapter is about a different ailment. And the book was published by the Hamilton Beach Company, which made a lot of vibrators in those days. Now we rely on them for our margaritas. That's right.
But then also vibrators. And they wanted you to know that if you took a vibrator home, you could treat your tuberculosis. Now, I frown on that. Tuberculosis is a bacterium.
Skeptical.
I'm sure that when you're having a coughing fit, a little percussion on your chest might feel better. But go to the doctor, please. But this nexus of health, I mean, we're talking about sexual health all the time these days. It's one of the ways that discussion of sexuality and sex toys and, you know, vulva health and all the things helps us move out into the mainstream discourse, right? But that's not a new trick.
Right.
And it's not really a trick because it's true. Sex and health really are intertwined, for heaven's sake. If your health gets bad, your sex life probably does too. One of the ways you can diagnose certain conditions is to try to figure out how your sex life got bad all of a sudden.
That's right.
And it's the canary in the mine shaft for so many things, and doctors don't all learn how to talk about it. I mean, we could go, literally, this is one of those situations where we could take any path away from this plaza of a topic and go all the way around the world.
That's right. That's exactly right.
Sex is everything in some ways.
That's right.
What a microcosm of all of it.
Yeah. So what was the state? I want to know do you have a sense of how many women in the United States, roughly speaking, in the 1950s were using vibrators or sex toys?
I do not have a clue.
Any idea how common it was then?
No clue. I know that it wasn't difficult to get a vibrator. Okay. It was, at no point in the 20th century was it difficult to get a vibrator. It just depends on whether you knew that these massagers that you could find in department stores were that same thing. Because you can still get those vibrators at those department stores in addition to here, where we, of course, will tell you some things about what to do with them. And at Macy's, not so much.
Not just for the shoulders and back.
No.
Yeah.
Although, yes, but not only.
Yeah. So in the 1950s, this is sort of the very beginning of the sexual revolution in many ways, right? The pill is about to be invented, and there's a demand that women have for that, and I think that's why the pill was invented, because there was a demand that was felt. And there's a proliferation, at least, of sex toys, it seems, from the evidence you've accumulated here, right? And then another thing happens in the 1950s, which is that you're born.
Right.
And you're born in a place where I would imagine discussions about such things as sex toys and women's orgasms and the clitoris probably didn't come up much, which was a very small town in rural Oregon.
Very small town in rural Oregon. And in the hills of the Coast Range. If we were there today and it was California, it would be blacked out. It was just a little wide spot in the road with a gas station and a store. And we didn't live in that part. We lived in the part where you had to go all the way up the road and you could maybe see your next neighbor another half mile up the road. So all the way almost to the dead end of the road into the woods.
Wow. And
so
it's a logging town, basically.
Logging town. It was then anyway. There's not as much logging as there was, and there's some, there's a little recreation. It's on the southern margin of what is Oregon wine country, but we didn't really have that yet then. And the Californication didn't begin until the late 1960s. When I was a little kid running around in the woods and reading fairy tales instead of going into church with my parents, who were really only there because my dad was a school teacher and felt that he really had to go there. To this day, I don't know what they were in terms of thinking about spirituality and religion, and don't know much about their politics, because we didn't talk about much of anything that could get weird. Not too much. So, living in a repressive environment, if you're a curious child, you ask a few questions that get you shut down, and then you run around and try to figure out the answer somewhere else.
How'd you do it?
Well, so many ways. Reading was super important. Yeah. When I started to, and reading got me access to almost everything but very much sex. Like there was some sex discussed in Life magazine and this and that, but not in an overt way, really.
No.
Not really. Not so much. And when it came time for me to want to really know some sexual mechanics, some knowledge, some safety, okay, what am I going to do here now? And that was in my teens. I really had a little bit of a challenge finding a book that would tell me anything. In the first place, I couldn't get to the library in the next town over by myself because it was 30 miles away. And by this time, we'd moved even further into the hills than I was outside of this little tiny hamlet outside of Eugene. And so literally, I had to wait until I could get a ride into town and say, I'm just going to go go to the library, and then try to look around in the library. And, this is still happening today for kids out there whose internet is too slow for them to want to wait around. And then if they try to go to the library, there's a nice librarian in the corner, and then there's a mean librarian who doesn't. But for the most part, most librarians are heroes of the revolution in every way. And eventually I was able to find a book that started to put things together for me. Before that happened, I was just sort of sniffing the air and realizing that there was something wrong having to do with the emotional state of my mom. And she waited another 20 years plus to tell me that she had been sexually abused when she was a girl.
Oh, wow.
But she did eventually tell me, which made that whole discussion, which by that time I already knew all about via feminist discourse, activism, having friends, etc. I mean, I was a teenager who got into some situations, right, in my learning curve. But my mother was a young woman when this happened. Yeah, she was probably 12 when this happened to her. So she didn't ever have any resources to get over it. She never saw a therapist. She never told anybody. She kept it. And we're hearing all of the Me Too discussions right now, and the way that people who have never had anything like this happen to them understand what it must be like to have that happen. And you would go tell, and you would call the cops, and it was like not.
Nope.
It really depends on who and where you are.
That's
if
right.
you think that those things are available to you, that's not what most women think.
Right. Did she tell your father?
Around the same time she told me, just before he died. So whatever kind of dance they did, it had an uncomfortable, problematic heart, and I could tell. I just, I didn't have sexual detail about them. But sometimes that kind of stuff, it just exudes off a person. I mean, I think plenty of people have been in hard relationships and found out later that everybody knew. Right? You're like, I think I'm keeping this so quiet. Yeah, no, actually, no. And, I was there with my little clipboard, being a baby scientist, observing my environment and trying to figure out what I was seeing, right? So it was pretty obvious somewhere to me that I'd better learn more about sex. It just seemed like this was relevant. And then, of course, hormones. And then living in the sticks, you're bored and you need some things to do. Sex is the thing to do. So all of those things sort of added up to set me up to be eventually a teacher and an activist before I was even out of high school. I mean, I actually was the kid that everybody else came to and asked questions of.
Okay.
I was that kid in school.
Okay.
And, and I think a lot of us who wind up being sexologists or sex people, sexperts, whatever, I think a lot of us were that kid, that there was something that made us go one or two steps further than anybody else in terms of curiosity and trying to find stuff out. And then it became known, even if we got put in a sort of a circle of opprobrium for it, people would sidle up and ask questions anyway. You can still get slut-shamed and be the person that somebody comes and whispers a question to in the line at lunch if their period is late.
Yeah.
So I guess I started young in that respect. But of course, there was a lot of exploration to do before I showed up at Good Vibrations.
Yeah. So this would have been, in the early 70s when you were a teenager, still up in Oregon?
Still up in Oregon in the woods.
Okay.
Outside of Roseburg this time, which is not exactly your, it's a lot of pot stores there now.
Yeah. Otherwise, not a cultural capital.
Not a cultural capital in the way that I wished it were. Like, I was interested in stuff. And I like to talk about my high school years as being lived in a period where it felt like it was probably more like the 40s than the 70s. It just didn't feel like what I knew was going on out there in the world around, in the bigger towns and the college towns and the cities. Those things weren't happening in a lived out way where I was.
So what did you read? What were the books? What were the things you could find?
probably the most important thing that I read for my entire high school years was Sisterhood is Powerful, the first really...
Robin Morgan?
The huge feminist anthology, which I got my mitts on, I think the year it came out, or maybe the next year. Had to go to Eugene to get it. Had to go far away to pick that thing up in the awesome bookstore. But I dog-eared that thing, and it had a little bit of everything. It had stories of domestic violence. It had stories of lesbians. It had stories of orgasms. It had stories of... It was like early feminism in a book. And early feminism, a little later feminism got pretty problematic around sexuality-related stuff,
Indeed.
right? And it wasn't that there was no problematic perspective then, but it was a door opened and everything that had been stuffed in that room tumbled right out. Now, we also later learned, well, that wasn't the first time the dang door had been opened. I was reminded just yesterday reading something about the Equal Rights Amendment, which has not been ratified by all the states, that it was first introduced in 1924, 3 or 4. I'm not even sure I ever knew that.
I'm not sure I did either.
And we're dragging our feet here, people. That's a long time. But the way that kind of information sent me in a sexuality-related direction, it was too early for a lot of sex-worried cultural feminism, sort of the rise of the anti-porn feminist, right. the rise of the, blame people who get into BDSM relationships for not getting out of them, and all of that, all the stuff that really that very much tainted the feminism of the 80s. I mean, we had to argue about this stuff. This was a real series of arguments that had to be had. And having those arguments with each other meant, among other things, that we were a little better equipped to have the arguments or have the talk with everybody out in the general world who didn't necessarily care what feminists were arguing about, but did know that there was a lot of porn all of a sudden, and how are we all going to talk about
right.
it? So that was actually, I stepped on the path that I'm clearly on now via that discussion. I felt judged around what feminist, anti-porn and sex diversity feminists were saying, sex nervous feminists were saying about sexuality that I, by that time, thought was pretty interesting and had done some of already, and didn't like hearing my sisters saying harsh things. And also by that time, I'd come out as bi. I was living in the queer community, such as it was in Eugene, as a participant activist, organizer, and we'd already had to tell everybody in town to vote to keep the LGBT rights ordinance on the books. We had one of those Anita Bryant things in Eugene in the late 1980s. And then in the early 80s, or did I say 80s? I meant 70s. 1978, I think, is when ours was. And then we had HIV. So HIV was a combination between this sexuality argument within feminism and HIV and the desire and need to do something about it was actually what switched me from sociology to sexology and brought me to San Francisco in the first place. And of course, sociology's got plenty of room to talk about sex, and I was enjoying doing that, but it didn't feel like the kind of activist work that I thought I should be doing.
Yeah, I want to stay on the 70s for a second here. The utopian moment in some ways, I think.
In some ways.
Yeah, I mean, I wasn't really old enough to be fully sexual at that point, but looking back now as a historian and having experienced it as a child and as a young teenager, I do think in some ways that was the best we've had. But so you're a teenager in the early 70s in the woods. You're instructing your friends about sex. You're kind of the girl to go to, I guess, in that way.
A couple different ways, actually.
Okay. Well, I want to ask about that too.
Yeah.
Okay, so that's the early 70s. And then by the end of the 70s, you're fighting with Andrea Dworkin and Catherine McKinnon about whether porn should be legal, right? And we'll get to that in a second. We'll
Not face to face, but with
Never?
their no, actually, I never had the pleasure. But actually, McKinnon's still around, so I suppose I should say yet. But they're troops.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah, in the famous porn wars within
Yes.
feminism, which we'll talk about in more detail in a second. But so that's an interesting. That's a bracket. It's an interesting bracket. I want to hear about sort of more what went on with you in between, right? Because there's this fissure within feminism is developing, as you're saying. And if you look at Sisterhood is Powerful, this anthology, it's, I don't know, dozens and dozens of authors, right? Dozens and dozens of feminists representing all, as you just said, all kinds of political strains within feminism. And I think, is Ellen Willis in there? I don't know if the blue stocking.
I think so.
But so there's definitely people who became identified as sex positive feminists like you in there, and people who totally are not in there as well. And so, but they're not fighting yet quite about this. It's not really a struggle yet, right? That's what you're saying. And I think that's right. But right there, when you're coming of age, is exactly the moment when that fight sort of comes to the fore and you take sides.
Yeah.
And so between, I don't know, your freshman year in high school or whatever it was, and 78, 79, when they start really going and they try to actually censor porn and sexuality. What's happening in your life to make you choose that side of that fight?
So I get to college a year earlier than I should. Because of a series of...
U of O?
U of O is where I went to school first. Actually, I had a semester at Portland State University because that's where you signed up if you wanted to go be in Summerstock Theater. I was an intern in Summerstock Theater and had some more adventures over there. That was when I got Lesbian Nation by Jill Johnston, which I thought was an important tome until I read it.
Definitely the end of civilization.
Wow, there's a lot going on in this book. Oh, this is complicated. Okay. And probably knowing that lesbianism could be complicated that early that's probably good. Yeah. If you're going to get into anything, being forewarned that it might get complicated. I'm just telling all you people out there, if you get into almost anything, it could get complicated.
Except for sex. It's always simple. Super straightforward, simple. We need no education about it, right?
Whoa. Yeah.
It's just clear as day. We know what it is.
So I had come out as bi. I knew that I wanted to find queer community. I went to college. I was too young to go into the Riviera room, the queer bar. And they were all like, well, bye, Carol, we're going to the bar now. And I was all, I'm a kid. And I got snuck in there once eventually, just field work, really. But a couple of young men and I started a gay youth group and began one of the earliest gay youth groups in the country, and we began to do all these support meetings and little parties for us that didn't involve all the chicken hawks flying around the edges and all the trolls and everything, and we thought of trolls in a different way in those days than we do now.
What's a chicken hawk in this case?
A chicken hawk is somebody older who is interested in somebody who's a teenager.
I see.
Yeah. So, and basically, then and now, young people often have a radar that's like, not so sure that that's the person to get mentored by. And of course, some people don't have a choice, don't have the opportunity to step away from that sort of often extremely problematic relationship. So we actually were a team of young people who, once you got to be 21, you got kicked out of our little organization because we wanted to keep it as an underage thing. And from that, I got a certain amount of credibility in the queer community from doing that being bisexual hadn't given me. And so I was part of this political year that I mentioned, the Anita Bryant years, which younger people are like, wait, what?
Oh,
like,
yeah.
Orange juice queen from Florida.
Explain Anita Bryant for our younger
former
listeners.
Miss America, evangelical Christian spokeswoman, trying to run around the country and undo all the LGBT civil rights legislation that was happening from city to city from the mid-late 70s onward. Not all the states, I think even at that point, had yet even repealed their laws against homosexuality. Yes, grasshoppers, it was illegal everywhere at one time, right? California's consenting adult laws didn't happen until the mid-1970s. Right. Yep. California, for heaven's sake. Right. And so by this time, this brewing problem between queer rights activists and feminists too, and everybody who was sort of alt culture, but especially the brewing fight between evangelical homophobes and queer people was up. It was lit, and Anita Bryant was sort of the person that was the PR for all of that. And this happened in several cities around the country over the course of 3 or 4 years, mostly relatively small cities, pretty progressive cities usually. And Eugene was one. We lost, but not by a lot. And later on, it got revisited. And
Eugene, Oregon passed an anti-LGBT ordinance in the 1970s?
It passed the ordinance was a pro-LGBT ordinance, and then it got repealed.
Okay.
So that was what happened. And that I think really set me firmly on a course where I thought about the political implications of us living our lives and trying to, make a positive space for us. We're having this conversation just a couple days after the Supreme Court heard a bunch of arguments about this very set of things, and the kinds of stuff that was being said in front of the justices was not all that different than you would have heard then, although if this had happened then, the lawyers for the government would have been a little more virulent in their homophobic language. And so by the time HIV became a thing, by the time the feminist porn wars had lit up enough to be called forever after the feminist porn wars, I had already had this experience with this ballot measure thing. I had also had the experience of crossing feminist picket lines to go see the story of O on campus because I was curious and I'd read the book and I wanted to see the movie.
Oh my.
And you had to cross a picket line.
You crossed a feminist picket line?
I did.
To see porn?
I crossed a feminist picket line to see a movie that was being presented as porn, although it wasn't probably quite as pornographic as I would have liked. And I was interested in somehow my background set me in a direction where I thought more exploration and more writing and more smut and more erotica and more was better. I was influenced by the discourses of the gay men's community pre-AIDS, which was a very, very sophisticated sexual freedom discourse. I didn't see that among the feminist activists that I knew for the most part, but I did see women in my own community, in my own life, trying to, struggle to figure out how we could make some sort of make open relationships safe and comfortable, figure out ways to incorporate role play and BDSM if we wanted to, the anything that any young person or a person who just steps up to sexuality exploration at any time in their life has to ask themselves is how do I do this? How do I take the shame and the training that monogamy is the only thing you're supposed to be doing, and all of the things that are already they're little charges that have been set, little depth charges in our psyche, and then we think we're doing great, and then all of a sudden, boom! I didn't know I could be this jealous, right? Those kinds of things. It isn't just feminist. It isn't just lesbian. It isn't just bi. It isn't just this could happen to anybody, including monogamists. Good God, those poor people get so jealous. And for what?
Oh, yeah. Let's talk about this. Yeah, polyamory. Okay. So I want to get back to your biography in a second, but yeah, this polyamory thing. I sort of moved back to the Bay Area recently, and I found that the damn place is full of polyamorous people, seems like.
Crawling,
right? Am I right?
Crawling with us.
What the hell happened? I come back and y'all are weirdos. And now, so, and you're, well, what's your position on polyamory? What's your, argument analysis? And then I'll poke back at you.
Well, so years and years and years ago at a book party at Good Vibrations, back when we were up at 23rd and Valencia Street, and there was only one of us, a woman who wrote a book about polyamory in the early 90s called Love Without Limits, the late Deborah Anna Pohl, came and spoke. And she said something that I thought was profoundly real, or at least super interesting. Whether it's real for everybody, I'm not sure, but super interesting, which is that there are people who are just wired to be non-monogamous, and there are people who are wired to be monogamous. And it's mixed marriages that get into trouble, which is fairly wise, I think. I think all of us have at least seen somebody in our orbit for whom that's like, yeah, maybe if that was the way both of you were expecting it to go, you maybe should have found other partners. Mm-hmm. But in the fabulous mix of, there's a from the at least 60s onward sweep of sexual revolution associated, cultural revolution for sure, changes that you can, if you're a historian or somebody who's lived through all of them, you can like sort of watch the stream flow, and you can see when the eddies of the stream come together and separate. And I think that polyamory is one of those things that was already being given a lot of room, sexual revolution wise. There's a feminist critique of that, which is a valuable critique. Mm-hmm. But at the same time, there were always plenty of people, including feminists, who were like, yeah, we'd like to figure out a way to get this right. We'd like to be able to stop being possessive of one another. This is another sort of a radical idea that it's bad to be possessive of your mm-hmm. partner. It's desiderata. It's fly, be free. If they're meant to return, they will kind of mm-hmm. thinking. And that was impactful to me when I was coming up, and it was part of the mix in the feminist sex wars. Not a really important strain of it, but part of it. And it was also something that the Bay Area, I think in particular, had so many of these sex communes, had such a strong gay men's community presence with a really well-developed set of ideas about open relationships there, and sexual freedom and all that stuff. So polyamory is both a sexual freedom through line to me. Mm-hmm. It's a community that relatively early on in its development had a brilliant, useful tome, The Ethical Slut, yep. Mm-hmm. Presented. Yep. Now, not every book about everything is created equal, and there is nothing that tops The Ethical Slut in terms of how, both the wisdom of a therapist and the wisdom of people who have been working out the kinks and open relationships for their entire adult lives come together, Dossie Easton and Janet Hardy, and make this book happen that people have clearly been looking for. And then that becomes a significant sex-positive text. And then I think you start to see folks who define sex positivity in some ways around openness, around, this is also true of a certain kind of embrace of kink, and you're right. That really did catch fire in the Bay Area.
Seems like it. Just seems like it. Yeah.
There's a whole bunch of other places all around the country too, where
sure.
they're way more polyamorous than you would expect. I went to Minneapolis and they were driving me around showing me things, and they were like, well, we're just going to go through this one St. Paul neighborhood. It's pretty interesting. They start driving, a little tree-lined St. Paul neighborhood. This is where so many polyamorists have bought duplexes.
They have neighborhoods now?
Yeah, because the snow gets too high in the winter to get to your other lover if you don't have them right next door.
Oh, man.
That's so smart. Look at you. Isn't that wonderful? So there's something about, I had an interview with a young man from some Oaklandish magazine or other a few years ago, and we had an interesting freewheeling discussion about sex positivity and good vibes and this and that. And then at the end he said, Can I ask you a question? Do you have to be polyamorous? Does who have to be polyamorous? And it turns out...
Well, your last name is Queen, so he's probably assuming...
me, yes, I do. Yes, I actually do have to be polyamorous, but
no, you have to...
But I was wired that way.
No, you have to decree whether he does.
Oh, right. Well, that might be... if people gave me that, I would...
Emperor of the world? Would you do it?
I would just...
Come on. Admit it. You would.
I would have when I was 9, for sure.
This is the agenda. We've heard about it.
I think I would have when I was 17. Right now, I feel like it would be too complicated.
You got more. You're too busy.
I'm not closing it down altogether, but I would like to be able to put a rubber stamp on whether or not somebody could have a pet.
Yeah.
I would like to do that.
Oh, really? Okay.
Nah, not really. But what I gathered was that he was in this new now crowd where everybody was poly.
Wow. Yeah.
But I don't know that he was really poly, and he was really having a rough time. And it's one thing to be, to have these depth charges set where you get jealous, even though you know that what you actually want is not to be jealous. I mean, that was what I suffered through this when I was 17 years old, which is nice to get it over with.
Did you get it? That was it when you were 17?
Well, no, it took a good decade
I'd like to hear about that.
It took a good decade to tackle that kind of stuff. And to me, it's really intertwined with, I want to start by saying it's intertwined with what you want and expect out of a relationship. It's like this question of how you're wired. I think it's possible for people who are in, quote, mixed marriages to have successful poly partnerships, but it's challenging. It's not for everybody. And even if you are wired that way, in order to have a close relationship with somebody, an ongoing relationship with somebody, you gotta learn some communication skills. You've got to learn some relationship skills. Do we learn good ones before we get out and start having relationships? Not always. So it becomes a field of practice. But of course, when you're practicing stuff like this, it's kind of like practicing football. People get hurt.
Get hurt, yeah.
And I'm not laughing because I think that's funny either, by the way. People getting hurt, it's not my brand. I don't like that. But on the other hand, it does involve practice. It does involve learning to communicate, and it involves self-esteem work. I mean, people think about this relationship stuff as being stuff that you have to engage in with another person. Of course, that's true, but you also have to engage in it alone. Sort of like we started out, this place isn't just about sex, it's about solo sex. And both parts are important, and their insight and the experience around them fits together, whether it's masturbation or whether it's working on yourself so that you can actually have a good relationship that's open, that doesn't drive you completely wild all the time with rage or fear or sadness. That's not a good, stable basis. So where does the jealousy come from? What is it telling you, right? What's the belief that the jealousy hangs on? It's an emotional response, but there's a reason that it's there. What's the reason? And trying to unpack that, it took me a while. It wasn't always easy to unpack jealousy in a relationship where good, clear communication wasn't yet the norm. Because in a relationship like that, sometimes there are surprises and you react. So I thought it was important to get a little less reactive about that kind of stuff. I thought it was really important to feel good about what was happening and to try to learn if there were ways to do that. So, later this gets operationalized in The Ethical Slut. I couldn't have written that book. I don't know that I went all the way down a path where I would have been able to be that person to say, no, there's a knowledge base to this. There's emotional work you can do. We can show you what it is.
Is there something that interferes with your happiness? Something that's stopping you from living the life that you want? There's a new online service that can help. BetterHelp Online Counseling can connect you with a professional counselor in a safe and private online environment. It's convenient, affordable, and effective. You can get help on your own time and at your own pace. You can schedule secure video or phone sessions, plus chat and text with your therapist. BetterHelp's licensed professional counselors specialize in treating depression, stress, anxiety, relationship problems, sleep issues, trauma, anger, family conflicts, LGBT matters, grief, and self-esteem issues. Anything you share is confidential. BetterHelp has 3,000 licensed therapists across all 50 states with 4 communication modes available: text, chat, phone, and video. You can start communicating in under 24 hours. Financial aid is available for those who qualify. BetterHelp is secure, convenient, and professional. It is not a crisis line. Best of all, it's a truly affordable option. Unregistered listeners get 10% off your first month with discount code RENEGADE. So why not get started today? Go to betterhelp.com/renegade. Simply fill out a questionnaire to help them assess your needs and get matched with a counselor you'll love. That's betterhelp.com/renegade.
But I do know that before I came to the Bay, before Dossie and Janet even ever met, I was on that path trying to figure out a way to make it work. Partly because I liked the idea of being in a sexually playful community. I mean, that was one of my goals too for coming to the Bay. It was like, ooh, are there sex parties there? Are there BDSM dungeons there? I'm getting my degree in sexology. I think I have to go check all those things out. I totally had an excuse for all of this. Like, here's my suggestion to everyone. Say, oh, no, this is research.
Field work.
This is field work. You wouldn't believe the things that you can write off your taxes when you really get involved. So, like, make it, but I'm serious in a way, make it your life's path to be in this world in some way. You don't have to earn your living here. Plenty of people think there's plenty of ways to earn your living here. I'm not sure that's entirely true, but have this be your community. Be in it deeply. Learn what the folkways are. I hear about folks in extremely conservative parts of the country, like driving to the next town over to a swing party or to a kink event in a hotel even sometimes. And there was a really interesting book a decade or so ago called America Unzipped where this author embedded himself in all of these, like, wait a minute, that's happening where?
Yep.
kinds of things. And it makes me think that helps explain why the Bay would be so crawling with polyamorists. Is how much harder must it be when you know you can't go outside and fly your freak flag, you have to make sure you know who's safe. It's like it was being queer in the 50s.
Exactly.
Right? When you could, most of these places you can't get busted now exactly for doing the things, but people could lose their kids.
Sure.
You know, you could not be welcome home for Thanksgiving.
Oh,
this is still a set of arguments, not just one. You know, not just one lifestyle is that lifestyle that you have to worry about. This is again a polarized time when, just like when I was lifting my head up and looking around and seeing that who came before me were all of the people who didn't have the opportunity to be who they were in a way that felt safe and real and with community and people having their backs. That was the homophile movement and the gay rights movement, right? That was one of the arguments that filters through the entire feminist sex wars, because some of them are like, but we're sex workers and you all are being so rude to us. And they're like, but my awful ex-husband showed me porn before and those are both valid things to hang an argument on. Probably not the right groups of people to be arguing.
Yeah.
Actually, frankly. But I'm not surprised about any of that. You know, and here we are again. We're in a moment where if we're looking around and paying attention, we know this is a pretty dangerous time for sex people. It's not right now. Even right here in River City is not what it was, because so many people who built this community in the Bay Area, you know, looked at their checkbook and split. You know, we're chased away by the changes of mostly the economics of the Bay Area, but in some cases I think people are leaving because of cultural reasons now too. And if you look around at the cars that are driving around the streets in the Bay, people have come here now from all over the place. And for the first time, maybe since the 50s, I think many of them didn't come here for the countercultural rep of San Francisco and the Bay.
That's right.
Everybody else who, you know, washed up on our shores did it because they really needed a safer space than where they were before. And they could once they knew that they were here, they were joyful.
That's right.
And, you know, how do we cut in the monogamists who just got here from Reno for a great job? How do we get them in on it?
Right.
That's a good question. I'm not sure I know the answer.
So you got here in the 80s, though.
I got here in the 80s. In the mid-80s, the HIV had already begun to burn out of control. In Oregon, I helped found, with a bunch of other people, including the lady from the Plasma Center, the Willamette AIDS Council in Eugene, and was a sort of state-level activist, too, for a while, where the person who impacted me the most was a monogamous Mormon in the health department who was like, it doesn't mean people can't masturbate. And I was like, oh, bless your heart.
Good guy.
People need some complicated messages in this time because it's all so complicated. And so when I came here to get a degree in sexology, what I really hoped I was doing was stepping into the AIDS prevention world on a, you know, sort of high level professional basis. And then boom, I crashed into Good Vibrations and realized that this is actually the place where I should focus and function from.
Why?
And have for, you know, close to 30 years now. Why? Because of your kind introduction. I mean, it is a revolutionary space, right? It certainly was then. It still is. It looks a little more put together now, but don't let that fool you, right?
It's still run by perverts.
It's still run by people for whom the sexual well-being of our neighbors is a calling.
That's right.
Which is not most people's calling.
No.
I mean, maybe swingers feel that way, but in a whole different way.
And if you think about it, wow, why isn't it? I mean,
well, yeah.
What a beautiful blessing you have given to so many people, not just women, over decades. I mean, we're talking about the greatest pleasure there is in life.
I'm pretty sure that if more people had more pleasure,
it's no small matter,
more awareness that they could be responsible for their own pleasure, more awareness that they could negotiate not only pleasure in sex, but what ways of living in a relationship. I mean, I talked about sex for so long, and then gender identity questions sort of, which were always there, of course, came and linked themselves to the queer movement in a way that the greater queer movement could understand, which was not always the case. And so that becomes part of the overarching thing that we need to talk about in order to make space for everybody. But the polyamory community and folks like this guy who was like sad about polyamory because it makes me hurt, him too, and the asexuals and like, I think relationality is another spectrum that we have to look at when we try to think really big picture about who is each person as a sexual, relational, gendered, sort of intimate entity. Who, and how do we find? And this is related to what you asked about polyamory as well. How do we find appropriate, compatible people to have the kind of play that we want to have with? That's like, sure, you can be whatever you want, but is your partner gonna play your games with you? And if not, who is? So a lot of course, relationships open for that reason too, because, well, you won't do that with me. How about if I do that with over there? And then one big happy family. And sometimes that works.
So here's my position on polyamory. And maybe you've heard this before. Intellectually and politically, 100% behind it. And not only that, I wish to God that I could be that. I wish that I could remove all jealousy from my brain permanently. If I could get an operation, I would do it right now, or take a pill, I would do it. Wow. It is the thing I like the least about myself.
Is anybody working on that?
It's the thing I hate the most about myself. Yeah. And I have done a ton of work on it over many, many years in many ways, but it is still a demon inside of me. Yeah. And are you telling me that I could actually eliminate it?
I don't know if I'm telling you that.
Okay.
But I do know that people who have been demonized by it have gotten through to the other side.
Yes.
But I think that what the woman said is also pretty right on, that, that some people are, some people are wired one way and some people are wired another way. Now, plenty of people are, just as plenty of people are bisexual, and bisexuals don't always get our due. All of a sudden, people are like, no, we have to call it pansexual, because I'm like, okay, I'm down, but have you heard the phrase bisexual invisibility before?
Right.
Can you, maybe think about that for a second? Because in the context of thinking about jealousy and open relationship polyamory stuff, I think there is also a connection. There's something that lives in the middle, and it has to do with how you are with a partner. So it's one of those alchemical things between two people where I'm pretty sure that if I went out in the world and found a partner that I didn't jibe with around this set of issues, that I could feel jealous again, right? Mm-hmm. I don't think it's completely gone out of my psyche. I mean, well, maybe it will, because who has the time to go out and find that freaking person? I'm not going to go look for that person. Jeez, I got a memoir to write. But plenty of people are in the game, right? Yeah. And it isn't the human condition to have it be completely not a painful issue, this jealousy business. We've got a lot of history that has its thumb on the scale. But you've probably also read Sex at Dawn.
Yes, I have. Chris Ryan has been on my show.
And so from that perspective, you also know that there's another thumb on the scale too. Mm-hmm. then maybe we have to bring Freud in. I don't know. Who's going to be the Solomon, to cut this particular line?
You said one of my favorite things ever. In response to it, someone asked you about whether you believe in whether it's nature or nurture that determines someone's sexuality. Your answer was, I don't care. Which I think is exactly the thing to say.
Well, right, because I think you have to. I don't think there's no reason we shouldn't look back to see what our own history has made of us, right? So I, in no way do I think nurture is irrelevant.
Right.
But if somebody is waiting to find the position on the gene to, come on.
Right.
Come on. In the first place, who exactly is funding that research?
Yep.
And why are they funding it?
Thank you.
And if you can answer those two questions for me, I can probably find the problem in the whole setup.
Exactly.
Those two things put together, just, crack that egg, and inside you will find somebody's trying to make $1 mazillion off of you.
And maybe control you, and maybe manipulate you.
Or control you. And we've got enough problems with that nonsense when we pick up our smartphones. Yeah. So, and which one of these days is going to, stick a little poker out and take some of our blood and send it on into,
right.
wherever, and then they'll know everything.
That's right.
I think it's really worth, continuing to interrogate power relationships in all of these spaces, right? Like me being a pubertal girl, dog-earing sisterhood is powerful, helped me think about power relationships. But I was already looking at my parents trying to go, what's happening here? Yeah. Like, who can speak up, who can't? What's this? And then the interpersonal power relationships that make it easier or harder if you try to live in an open relationship or any relationship at all. And the power relationships or the power differentials in the world that let some people, get away with building their sexual utopia before they die in prison, and screw up a whole lot of other people on the way, and the people who get pulled into that kind of stuff because they're vulnerable, right? Like there's no. I think people often think of sex positivity as a way of just sort of glamorizing and valorizing having a lot of fun sex, and yay! There's at ground, there's nothing wrong with having a lot of great sex. Yay! But that's not what sex positive means. And there isn't anything about sex positivity that should close the question of how do we figure out how power differentials have affected us. And, and a power differential can be as sweet as someone thinking, I just can't bear to displease that person. I love them so much. I value them so much. That's still a power differential. And so I don't think it's surprising if you feel like jealousy is a demon, but it's also, it's also your innards trying to think about what works right for you. So in that sense, it's not a disease to be eradicated by the next polio vaccine. It's something else. Yeah. It's our inner self negotiating, raging, communicating. That's what it is.
I will never be able to just take a shot or a pill. You're telling me?
I didn't say that.
I actually have to work through this and talk through it and think through it.
I'm pretty sure that when we get done with our interview, you tweet out to Elon Musk that you think there needs to be a pill for this, he'd be all, hey, I bet on Mars.
And he always listens to what I say, so that'll work, yeah.
There's somebody out there who one of these days,
I hope so,
will try to figure all of this out. And maybe it will be the Mars trip that will get someone to do it.
Probably some guy right down the street in one of these tech offices.
So who are we going to put on the Mars trip? Well, we're going to have a bunch. Well, we're going to need, I don't know, 36 people to start a colony. Are we going to get a lot of married couples? Well, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean, they might cook up that shot for us.
Yeah.
Whether that's good for humanity, I don't have a postdoc, so I'm not really sure, but I will tell you that it's worth interrogating.
I'm going to want to see the ingredients list before I even think about it.
So wise.
Yes.
So wise.
Now, you mentioned power differentials. Some people have said that is somewhat important in sexual relations.
Oh, yeah.
Now, I was in a long-term relationship until recently and began dating recently. And so and also moved to the Bay Area at the same time. So one of the things I noticed was this proliferation of polyamory, or seeming proliferation of it, and a proliferation of a particular discourse, which comes from your world, your people. You're partly responsible for this. I keep hearing about this damn binary. Dominant, submissive. Everyone's one or the other. Pick a side. What side of the slash are you on? Are you a D or an S? And this is even among so-called vanilla types. It certainly is prominent in the kink community, as far as I'm aware, and in the queer community. And I have issues with it. And I know you know Foucault, and Foucault would certainly have issues with it.
I have issues with it.
And I'm not angry about it, but I think I wish people would think about it a little more. And I think it's a bit of a mistake the way that, especially in kink, as what I've seen from the outside, is sort of an attachment to it. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Well, partly because you're in that world, if you go out into that community, your role, your persona are connected, right? Not everybody doesn't just show up in their street clothes and try to figure out who's going to tie who up. You've already got some signifiers that you've become very attached to, possibly fetishistically so, and not everybody's okay with setting that aside and starting from scratch. Like it would be kind of interesting to get a whole bunch of kinksters in a room naked and then throw one collar into the middle and see what happens. That was kind of an awful thing to say, but also on the other hand, it would be great performance art. Great performance art.
And a sport too.
And a sport. It could be a sport. So as long as everybody, signed a little waiver before they went in. I wouldn't want to just I don't want to do a bad thing. So the either or thing, is so not true for everyone. But I don't go outside much anymore. So if people are not valorizing the switch, or
explain that. The
switch being the person who is happy to play either role or to cross these binary boundaries and take play in a different direction, or maybe not be quite as top and bottom, up and down, dom and sub about the whole thing. Because there are plenty of kinky things that people can incorporate into their play that don't require this power differential to lead. Sometimes the power differential, people develop their own power levels with one another, whether or not they're vanilla, as you mentioned. Some people are very, very, very interested in making sure that the other person is the initiator all the time, because self-esteem comes from that source, as well as sexual pleasure and, getting active. There's lots of interesting things and this is, this is where good sex therapists live and do their magic, is helping people figure out whether they're setting themselves up for particular kinds of experiences with relationships and sex because of these maybe even unacknowledged ideas about what's possible. But the infusion of kink and this are you a dom or a sub space in it, I think is interesting in that it gives people who always needed that a place to come out and play and find some more people who are compatible with them.
Yep.
That's extremely important. I mean, when I was learning about not just kink play, but kink community values and, you know, what we say when we go to San Francisco State and do the Kink 101 lecture to the group of students, you know, that kind of overarching talk. And this was in the 80s when I stepped into that part of this world, and what I would hear was, for so long, the main way many of us got what we wanted was by picking fights in our relationships, right? You know, if you actually think it's really hot to get slapped, and at this point, we shouldn't even, we should be so far beyond this as a culture. This is like talking, you know, asking for a talk. This isn't even safe to talk about anymore. But in those days, the kink folks were like, we've seen this stuff go down. We've done it ourselves. We know that doesn't mean that everybody in every situation that gets volatile like that is doing this. They're not. But some people needed this community to come to in order to be fully consensual about what they always were drawn to do.
Okay. Yes.
So.
Yes.
Great.
Yes.
Good. That's good. That's a step into the light, even if everybody continues to wear black the whole time. That's good. And within that, I think there will be people who feel like, for personality-based reasons, or this is what I'm the best at reasons, or I don't know if I could do that, but I can do this, or I respond to this and I don't really respond to that. I mean, there's all these, you could say any of that about vanilla sex too, right?
Sure.
It's just that there are so many other things within kink that you could sort of evaluate as, oh, I want to do this, not that. I want to do this from the top, that from the bottom. And if everybody got really, 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 really thorough about doing their 3-list exercise, there would be a lot more switches running around saying, oh, yes, I could play in either direction, depending on how I feel at any given time, depending on, you know, the people around me, depending on what the party is all about. There's lots of contingents. You know, the 3 lists, just in case any of your listeners don't know what I'm talking about, let me just say. So the 3-list method is a way of thinking about what you want in a kink context, in a sex context, in a safer sex context. You can do it in a bunch of ways. You could do it in a, like, this is how open I want my relationship to be or not be kind of a way too. You could use it that way too. Make 3 lists. The yes list. Yes, I know I want that. I'm into that. I've never done that, but I would be into that. I'm pretty sure I'd be into that. I'll do it the first chance I get. That's a yes. The no, hopefully most people know what their no's are, or at least they can begin to make that list. That's a negotiation point that keeps you safe and keeps you from tweaking out because you did something you really didn't want to do. And then the maybes. The maybe list is, for many, many people, really long because it's contingent. It's contingent on, who am I with? How's my trust level? Am I safe? Is it warm enough in here? You know, do I have to pee right now? No, I can't start doing that until I pee. There any reason is okay for a maybe. Any reason, because it's where you're at with your willingness and your interest, right? That kind of stuff can fluctuate. And it's good for us to acknowledge that it can fluctuate. It's good for us to try to stay tuned about where we are vis-a-vis that. You know thyself. It's not bad sex information. And then you make your list and you say, oh, show me your list. I'll show you my list. And then you figure out, okay, where's the compatibility on these lists? And then you remember that maybe also is contingent on how much in love are you? How turned on are you? How horny are you? How high are you? all of that. Those things move the needle. This should, honestly, they could, after they say, here are some problems you can have when you go out and have sex, here are some things that you need to know in order to protect yourself. Then you throw out all the rest of sex education after that and put this in it. That would be great. But of course, in sex education, we can't actually talk about sex. Having it, can't have that. So we have to make our youthful mistakes and then finally, if we're lucky, stumble into a space where we can start to break it down like this, where what I like about the 3 lists, and especially this maybe business, I think the maybe is where it's at. That's where the juice is, and it's also where some of the danger signs are. That's where the complication in all directions is. Great complication, problematic complication, all of it. Then, what I really love is that no two humans 3 list would be exactly alike, probably. And if they really, really, really got specific, each one of us has our own sexuality. It's not like there are a few like sort of groups or tribes and everybody within them is the same. Anybody who goes in with that theory is disabused of it if they're paying attention, because it's not the case. And one of the things that I get from the question that you asked me initially is that the way the community itself is thinking about these issues helps shape what becomes possible when you go in.
That's right.
And if it's gotten more rigidly binary than when I started hearing about the philosophy of it 3 decades ago, I think somebody needs to parachute in and mix it up. Honestly, I don't think a lot of people who are drawn to play communities and kink communities want and expect what they find there to be very rigid. Some people like and are turned on to rigidity, of course, and I don't mean it that way, that too. But
rigid role playing, for instance,
rigid
like
role playing,
always being a particular way, right?
Yeah. I like it like this. That's the only way I like it.
But that's rare, you're saying?
That's relatively rare. There's not much dance you can do with that. You either want to play like that or you don't want to play like that, right? If there are a lot of options on the table, it might take a little longer and a little more communication to figure stuff out. What is it that people are going to want to do tonight in this moment, as opposed to, I always do it like this. For those people who always do it like this, I'm not trying to say, no, you don't do it like that. That's wrong. I'm not. The only thing I ever say should or that's wrong about is imposing your sexual will on somebody else. Right. That's a no-go in this. In order for this world to exist, we have to figure out how to keep it consensual. And consent is complicated by lots of things: assumption, knowledge base, beliefs. There's a bunch of stuff that. Consent by itself is simple. Getting everybody to do the simple consent is what's complicated. So that remains a thing to work on. But when people can go into a space and then negotiate some things, that's some skills of flexibility that are useful everywhere, even out of bed or dungeon, I might add. They're good skills. I just encourage people to value them and practice them.
So I'm thinking through some things here, and they're philosophical. And once again, I'm bringing up Foucault, although he's not necessary here. One of the things I've noticed since I've come to the Bay Area and been sort of exposed to the new sexual world here is this dominance, submission, binary, and also this coming from kink, coming from the queer community, coming from feminism, coming from you. Is this, I'd say at the center of it, is this fair to say that your mission is not necessarily sexual freedom, it's actually communication? You're principally interested in communication between people and working out and understanding and self-knowledge and knowledge of the other, the partner. Is that right?
I think that's right. That's right. It's certainly, sexual freedom is an extremely rich and lively space to do these inquiries. It's super important there. Without good communication, you have increasingly problematic sexual freedom, and then that turns back into a situation where people don't give you the space to be who you are. Mm-hmm. I'm talking about the big you, not just the you or the me, yep. but everyone. And the very discussion of who you are becomes problematic and fraught. So I want communication and respect for diversity, and the communications that's going to entail. Because this isn't all just between partners. This is all also between, this is some people talking to the Supreme Court 2 days ago. There are communications of all kinds. Yeah. This is a cultural communication opportunity and need, as well as an interpersonal one and a solo introspection one. But without the solo introspection and being able to communicate with another person and being able to evaluate whether you actually successfully can communicate with another person, then all the rest of it is hard to keep track of and to keep moving in a positive direction. Yeah. Sex positivity, as I said before, isn't just about woohoo, although I do not want to throw any cold water on anybody who is enthusiastic to the point of cheering about their sex life. That's so great. That's lovely. But it's about diversity, access. It's about us understanding that sex is important. It's not going to be the same way for everybody, that there needs to be information, there needs to be resources, and that we need to be able to figure out with each other what's the right way to do it when we're about to do it.
Yep.
It's I think of this as so basic, but I understand that I'm sitting in a different seat than a lot of people who don't think, this is not
Quite
basic.
Literally.
And yet, and yet it's what it all boils down to for me.
Yeah.
Like without taking this seriously on a sociocultural level, without me having, done sociology before sexology, I don't know if I would think the same way. I'd probably be a sex therapist if I hadn't done the sociology first and come from we have to understand the sociocultural piece. It constrains and shapes the personal piece, just as the personal piece, if we can lift our heads up and start to talk sexual freedom language, turns right around and influences.
Sisterhood is Powerful taught us that the personal is political.
It really, really did.
Really is.
And I don't want anybody to think that that's only true for women.
Of course not. I believe
been really true for women, because apparently only Nathaniel Highmore thought that thing might be an orgasm in 1,000 years of people doing that. But that's
visionary.
There had to be a little more sociocultural movement in order for us to get to good vibrations. Okay. That means.
So let me offer a challenge sort of from academe and then come back to your life. So postmodernists would have a worry about this, right? Now, I'm with you. I think your approach to sex and sexuality is essentially what I would say to other people. Okay, so I'm with you in terms of practical applications, what we actually do today about sex, right? I'm with you 100%. Now, the POMO people would say, hang on now. When you go into, just for instance, a kink space, which again, I've sort of been observing from outside recently, it's a house full of rules. It's a house full of rules, Carol. It's a bunch of people telling you what you can and can't do. Now, what you're doing here and have been doing throughout your career, Foucault and postmodernists and Derrida would say, is placing, or they might even say imposing, language and categories and rationality and science, goddammit, on these things that used to be free of those constraints, those repressive apparatuses, rationality, science, even talk, communication. I mean, those become not just categories, they become containers, don't they? Right? You become a dominant or a submissive. You become bisexual or not, right? You're a woman or not. So that's the concern for me, and especially having observed some of kink and some of leather from the outside, it's like I see a whole bunch of fucking rules and people like policing the rules all the time, which I get, I understand, and you get a great presses for why that was necessary for a whole cohort of people. So I'm not denigrating it. I'm just worried about it. Do you have that worry?
I have that worry. I actually think that that what you're observing is much more maybe solidified into what you've observed. Thanks to the influence of the internet on our communities. I think it's its own container, isn't it? There's a version of, and its own space where things get categorized and siloized, and somebody on 8chan thinks it should be free, but then they have their own ways of shaping reality. So, I'm actually really impacted by postmodernism. There's a way in which the notion of multiple subjectivities, like the whole rest of my life, I think probably wouldn't have been possible without hearing that phrase.
Exactly.
It's extremely important. When I say that there are 7 billion sexual orientations, I'm borrowing back.
That's what I always say. I always say that.
Multiple
it's
subjectivities.
7 billion. That's right.
Or 7 and a few.
That's right. Or 8 billion sexualities.
We're getting there.
I say genders too. 8 billion genders too.
Yeah. And the idea that we would take the idea that we would take this way of understanding that not everybody can fully understand each other. I mean, one, it's easy for Foucault and Derrida to say everybody's free.
That's right. That's right.
Buddies.
In their studies in Paris. That's right. From behind their desk. That's right. I agree.
Or from the bathhouse.
That's
or from
right.
where it
That's
was
right. The bathhouse in San Francisco.
Studying.
That's right.
And
that was Foucault's field work, Carol. Come on.
Well and good. I respect it.
That's right.
I respect it very much. I wish there had been a few more condoms, because right now, instead of telling us what he thinks, he's just rolling over in his grave.
That's right.
That's right. That it's easy to say from people who have found space to move the needle on the way they understand the world and how it is and how it could be and should be, maybe even. And it's a whole other thing to throw a bunch of people who got real turned on when they read 50 Shades of Grey and invite everybody over to a party and to try to figure out how everybody's going to get home safe and happy on the other end without making a specific rule about, and don't use zip ties for your damn bondage. It was just a book. So there's, I think, a kind of play that you can find that has much less of this kind of either or, you must do this, you can't do that kind of behavior. You find it in pockets, in subcultures, in special organizations that are there, but you have to sort of be tapped and invited to come in. It's not entry level play. And kink isn't entry level anyway, really. I mean, you can boil it down to some pretty atavistic moves. You can. Some people do. But it's also a kind of play that has its own logic. And I think some of these rules are there to enforce the logic, especially and the way that the people who threw the party A, are worried about liability, B, like to see their party look and the shit that they like to see go down when the party's on. And when it's really lit, it looks like that. And you could set your parties up all different ways, but when most people have entered the community and the scene through a particular door, they're all bright-eyed and bushy-tailed too, aren't they? They're excited to be there, right? Often, and there's some imprinting probably that goes on. Like, I think that there was I could be completely wrong about this. I'm just going to say, though, I think there was a particular kind of trajectory that internet connection stepped in and affected. Because there are ways that you communicate online that are both more circumscribed, but that was also the era of everybody saying whoever they wanted their avatar to be online and having computer sex without ever having to prove that you did or didn't really know what a tampon was, for one example. And that was a really interesting opening up of possibility. On the other hand, you couldn't just switch yourself into that world in meat space, or could you? Mm-hmm. I don't know. I really, really, really think we are in the middle. We are nowhere near the end.
Oh yeah.
We are in the middle of trying to figure out what these cultural changes mean to us as societies, as a species even. Yeah. And of course, the kinds of cultural changes we've been talking about are a lot more prevalent in some parts of the globe than others, aren't they? Yeah. Right? The postmodernists would have some things to say about that too.
Definitely. Yeah.
And it means that whenever we get into this kind of discourse, people feel invited in or they feel left out, even based on us starting to talk about sex this way, much less looking at intersectional questions, much less figuring out, what the women who were in grad school with Derrida and Foucault had to say for themselves if they didn't have to drop out because they got pregnant. Yeah. It's deep. This is all so deep. This is why this is such a global set of interests for me. I had a girlfriend once who said, I could see if sex was your business. I could see if it was your hobby. For you, it's everything. And I'm all, it's not all one thing. Yeah. It's the postmodern jewel with facets. If you walk all the way around it, you don't even know you're looking at the same thing because each facet is so different.
I agree. Absolutely. It's infinite. It is everything. It certainly can be.
It certainly, there's plenty to dive into and not find the bottom of the pool.
I agree. Last question. I want to take you back to the woods. Did your parents stay together, married?
They did. Mm-hmm. They did. My parents stayed together. I remember bitching at them to get a divorce when I was a teenager. Like that would have helped. I don't even know. I don't know. I'm in my early 60s and I think about them sometimes and I realize I'm pretty sure I didn't know them. Like, you think you know your parents. You think you know your kids. We're all... It's 7 billion sexual orientations. It's 7 billion genders. It's 7 billion atomized humans who figure out how to understand one another, and which is why I think communication is so important. Because how else do you get your bird seed and you follow it into the forest, right?
When did they find out about you and what you were up to?
I started this gay youth group. I took a gay studies class my first year of college. That was when student-taught classes were a thing in many universities, not just a couple of them. I took a student-taught gay studies class. It was amazing. I wrote my paper about bisexuality. I was like a rebel. And when my grades came home, my dad opened them and read them.
Whoops.
And when I came home, he was ready for me and he said something to the effect of, I thought I raised you to be somebody. I thought you were going to be somebody who would make a difference in the world. I thought you'd be a lawyer or your mother wants you to be a translator at the UN, and now you're telling me you're a homosexual.
Oh, that's the problem with being a homosexual, is that you don't change history? That's the problem? That's a new problem.
Said, well, bisexual, actually, Dad, but if you want to say, just let's keep it with homosexual right now.
Whatever.
Let's not get any more complicated.
Yeah, right.
And I was
Don't
like,
blow his head up.
So are you telling me that trying to understand this piece of, basically I said to him what we've been saying for the last 2 hours. Right. Are you telling me that trying to understand this isn't culturally significant? And by the way, I could still be a lawyer. I could still be a translator. It's not, I was like, Dad, it's not a job description.
Not yet.
Little did I know that within 5 or 10 years it would be a damn job description. But that was, that's interesting and telling that that's where I showed up right in between Stonewall and It's a Job Description.
That's right. You did.
Right?
Yep. Mm-hmm.
Right in the middle of that, decade?
Yep. That was a hot decade for you.
It was a hot decade.
For everyone.
By the time I turned around after this whole Anita Bryant political situation, you could go get a job at the Gay and Lesbian Task Force as a homosexual. Not many jobs were available, but there were some. And then of course he said, don't tell your mother.
Okay.
Like, okay. So then I started the gay youth group, and I was like, Dad, we have to tell my mother now because I'm about to be in the newspaper. He's like, oh, all right. He was so worried. And we laid it all out. And my dad is riding along here. He didn't make it long enough to really be a big cheese and pea flag, but he would have if he'd lived a little longer, because he was clearly pretty bossy about all this.
Oh, so
he would have loved to. He gave me a birthday card, and it had the word "gay" in the little poem.
Oh.
And he said, I went to the stationery store and I told those old ladies, my daughter is gay. She's a lesbian, and I want a card with the word gay in it. And this poor old women, who even knows what they thought about my dad doing it. But he tried to take the steps to repair that initial little outburst. And my mother said, oh, I would be so much more upset if you came home and told me you were pregnant.
Oh.
And then for the rest of both of their lives, they did what all my classmates had done and came and talked to me about, do you think our friend that we've been having dinners with for many years is gay? I'm like, well, yes, Dad, I think they are gay.
Okay.
Do you think that woman that I taught with, who lives with that other woman, is a lesbian? Dad, if those women aren't lesbians, I don't know what a lesbian is. Yes, I'm pretty sure those are lesbians right there. And also, Dad, the reason that she only taught with you for 2 years and then went somewhere else and somewhere else and somewhere else is because her contract didn't get renewed because she was a lesbian. Hi, Supreme Court, are you listening right now? And Mom was like, do you think I could be a latent homosexual?
Oh, my.
Because no, she was sexually abused as a girl, and she never felt like sex was right, and then she got into this loop of maybe I've been trying to be somebody I'm not, which I don't think was the case. I think it was, no, you never got any help. You never were able to tackle it. You didn't actually get past it ever. But whoa.
But she told you.
Yeah.
And she told
and
you.
She eventually told my dad.
You.
And I really wonder, I know, isn't that interesting?
Not a coincidence, though.
And but I really think that my coming out to them and the changes that ensued in our family after that, the way that I came home and started talking about things that nobody ever could talk about before. My suspicion is that that's why she wound up telling him and me. that without that change in the discourse of the family, I wonder if she ever would have said a thing to him.
Yeah.
And as it was, she waited until after the perpetrator had died to say anything to my dad, just in case he decided to go and make a big fuss.
Yeah. But it sounds like your family really changed. Really around these issues.
I think maybe they did. And of course, everything was, it was the 70s. Everything was changing.
True.
Families were changing
True.
for all kinds of reasons.
Yeah.
Right? There was me, like urging my mother to get the hell out of there and be her own woman. And I don't know if she knew how to do that really, to be honest. But the ways that, the things that were happening with my brother's trajectory through the world made them. But that's being a family, isn't it? Mm-hmm. Like you think you know how it's going to go. I hear a lot of young people like, it's going to be like this. It's like, it's going to be a way. Mm-hmm. It's going to be something. And you don't know yet how it's going to be. You won't know how it's going to be until it's been that way. Right. Because what you've got now is a couple, 3, 4, 5, however many entities that no one person is in control of as much as you might think that's how it is going to roll. That's not how it's going to roll. Yeah. So,
but you did
sorry, Dad. So immediately Dad, of course, becomes pro-gay so that he could stay linked in to how it was rolling for me.
So you changed his history. You changed the history of your family, it sounds like, to some extent.
I don't think I understood thoroughly that I was doing that when it all started, but I did understand that nothing in the political and social space that I was in would change if people couldn't come out. And I knew that I had to do that there. I mean, the grades preempted my own timing, but it would have happened around that time. Right. And it would have happened because there were some ways of thinking about how we could and needed to change that I bought into. The same as the open relationship stuff. In it on a, string theory holds that somewhere else I'm monogamously married with 15 kids, but I'm not on that string. I'm not in that universe. I'm in this one. Yeah. And all of us could be living different lives than we are right now. And some of us won't actually internalize that and start to move away from their trajectory until later. We're not binary. We're not either or. We're not born that way in the sense that there is no possibility of thinking how we want our lives to be. Right. And that's just everybody's opportunity.
Yeah. You know what I want you to do next with your life?
Oh, please tell me.
Exactly what you want to do. And I want to say thank you for doing this.
Well, I have had such a wonderful conversation with you. Thank you for doing this.
This has been really great. You're a hero. And again, just keep doing whatever you want to do, Carol. Thank you.
Thank you.
This is the Unregistered Podcast, and I'm Thaddeus Russell. To buy tickets for my upcoming events in Des Moines, Iowa, and Chicago, Illinois, go to thaddeusrussell.com/talks. Thanks for listening.